Well, hey, we're back. Welcome to the Always About People show. I'm your host, Chris Allen, and we're back for another incredible discussion today. I've got my friend Chuck Cooper in the studio today, and I promise you, we were just talking through a few things before the show began, and we have some important content to cover today because these are unprecedented times. See what I did there?
It's great.
This is my friend Chuck Cooper. He is the founder of Whitewater Consulting. He helps small businesses, mid-sized businesses with really all of their HR needs. Sometimes I would argue that it goes beyond HR. It's leadership, it's HR, it's culture, it's strategy, it's benefits, it's insurance, it's all of those things. And I'm just grateful to have you in the studio today, Chuck.
It is great to be with you, Chris. It's always a pleasure and always an honor to be here.
Yeah. So Chuck wrote a book. His book, Unprecedented, right here, came out earlier this year in 2022. And we're going to be talking about some topics from this book. But what we really want to do is talk about how this book applies to the conversations that are happening today. And so on this show, we try to make sure that we're covering topics, relevant content that leaders are talking about, that organizations are wrestling with, all that involve people. And I think we've seen a pretty good shift in organizational cultures over the last couple of years.
It is definitely it's a fascinating time to be in the people space.
It is. Well, people are people.
People are people.
Which means that it's probably always a fascinating time to be in the people space because it involves change. People change. People never remain constant. And so we need to be changing as well. For those of you who are watching this live, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, we'd ask that you get engaged. We would love to answer your questions, to respond to your comments live. In fact, it keeps it way more fun for us in the studio. And so I want to encourage you, send in a question. If you've got a question for Chuck, we'll get to it. If you're watching this as a recording after the fact, please still respond, send in a question, make a comment. We can still get to those after the fact.
Sure.
So with that said, let's go. Chuck, this book, Unprecedented, was written kind of at an opportune time. I mean, you mentioned before 15 months in the making.
Right.
But kind of spurred by the COVID transition that we saw in the workplace. Maybe just share a little bit of the story of how this book got started, how you started thinking about it, and how you put your ideas together.
So really, it was a great journey. I think the way that it got started was obviously when COVID hit and we went to shelter in place, it really gave a lot of us, myself included, opportunities to be able to spend more time at my desk. And I really began to reflect on growing up in a family-owned business and really recalling the relationships and the way that my parents, my grandparents really led that company. And so the relationships that they formed with their people. And I looked at how those relationships had evolved over the years. And from one that has worked with a lot of small and mid-sized companies over the last 20 years, there's been just a chasm that continues to open up right now in the area of trust, respect, and really the valuing of people between leaders and their people. And so I began to sit down and write on a daily basis, just some thoughts, not really planning to write a book. But after doing this for about 5 months, started to look at the writings that have been done and saw some common threads. And basically we put this together really as a way to, ultimately the book is for the entrepreneur and the small business owner to help them kind of navigate that world of being an employer from post-COVID to today as we go forward.
Yeah. So times have changed.
Correct.
People haven't necessarily changed. In looking at your family business and all that was related there, looking back generations at how they treated people, and then looking at the times that we went into. You used a phrase that I hadn't heard in a while: shelter in place. Like you haven't heard that one in a while, but that really led to you putting some of these thoughts together.
It really did. I will tell you, I'm totally honest and say I'd never dreamed of writing a book. It was never a desire or a passion to do. But I think that once I started writing and started seeing, what we were writing each and every day, that I felt like that there was a purpose behind that time.
Yeah.
And I think that as I look back over the period that I wrote the book, it helped me in a lot of ways just to be able to be introspective. It helped me personally, but it also helped me professionally in being able to communicate more effectively, more efficiently with my clients.
That's great. Well, I think what I would love for you to share are some of the stories of maybe it's leaders, founders, visionaries, business owners, how they have connected with the book, and maybe what are the issues that they're wrestling with that are being addressed, that are sort of coming to the surface right now.
Yes, I've been overwhelmed really with the feedback and the comments that I've gotten from people that have read the book over the last, since May. And I think that the two chapters that really have been focused on the most has been the chapters on leadership, and then also on the multi-generational workforce and how we go about bridging that gap. Yeah. And so those are probably the two key areas that we've have received feedback. But what I'm seeing right now when I talk to my leaders that I'm speaking with is they recognize that we've come through unprecedented times. They recognize that in many cases they do need to make changes themselves on how they are leading their people. And so there's a segment of those business owners that are open to making this change. But then there's also another segment that is very, very resistant, very reluctant to make any change because they've always done it a certain way. And so it's been really interesting to have those conversations to see where people are.
All right. So you're watching this show. The question that I would give you and pose is, are you a leader that's willing to change? Because it might involve some deep change. Or are you sort of stuck? And then the next question would be, why are you stuck? What is holding you back from potentially changing in this multi-generational workforce, in this environment, in this culture, in this political landscape that we're currently in? What's keeping leaders from changing? Let me just ask you, what do you believe is keeping leaders from changing?
I think that is something that it's interesting when I talk with those owners that are very reluctant. If I continue to ask questions and push, I see the emotion levels continue to rise. And so I think that at the end of the day, when you look at what is causing that, the root issue, I think for many of us, his fear becomes a real issue because I think that, again, I think COVID, it really put us in a moment in time where we know all the answers. We know where to go to solve our problems as far as a leader. But the reality was when COVID hit, we recognized there's so much that's out of our control. How's our family going to be impacted? How am I going to be impacted? How are people going to be affected? And so there's just a great amount of fear that they, that generated from that moment. And I think that has continued on to today as we look at how do we change, because the way that we've always done things was
leaders from maybe it's a willingness to change. Let's go to this multi-generational chapter that you mentioned, because I'm hearing it as well. How do I lead in this multi-generational workforce? And then that question is typically followed up with all kinds of bias towards the next generation, like they are this, they are that, whatever beliefs you might hear. They're different and I don't like it. How are you helping leaders manage a multi-generational workforce?
A lot of the leaders that I talk to are people that are essentially kind of in their 50s, early 60s. A lot of them have kids that are very similar in age as my kids are. And I think that the way we communicate with our kids, we recognize that not each of our kids are different. So we communicate with them differently. And I think that we have to take a lot of those same principles and apply that to our people. When you have a multi-generational workforce, there are differences in the way that different generations want to be communicated to and the way that they receive information. But we can't paint with broad brushes. And I think that's where I was guilty of this for a while myself. We have to recognize that everybody is an individual. And so we have to understand who that person is and get to know them and build a relationship. so that we can help them bring the best version of themselves to work.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's really important. And Chuck, we've talked about it on this show before, maybe not us specifically, but, there was this tendency to almost treat people like they were machines. And if I can just treat everybody the same, I can set a job and a task in place, and I just create jobs to get that thing done.
Right.
And then on behalf of people, there was an acceptance of that kind of a culture. And I'm just going to put up with it because I will gain my value or my needs in some of. And so you have a generation that's looking for some of those needs to be met in the workplace. And that's forcing leaders to have to do some things differently. Is that what you're seeing too?
So, yes, they are definitely having to do things differently because we're bringing in a different way, not only the communications that we have, but also in just the verbiage that we use. Whether it's in my generation, it was always my boss or my manager, versus the younger generation coming in, it's their coach. The way that we do performance reviews. But I think that even as it relates to really, again, my generation, a lot of us focused on paycheck. I mean, how much am I earning? That's my security, versus the younger generation focusing on purpose.
All right. So purpose real quick.
Okay.
And I know we're circling around a number of topics here. I promise we'll bring this back together. But a younger generation focused around purpose. How does a leader drive purpose within their team or organization?
I think first of all, they have to have clarity themselves on what that purpose is. And so I think that in a lot of ways, it means you're having to bring your management team together, bring your people together to talk about what is the purpose of this organization. It's not just solely on profit, but what is that next level? How can we go deeper? And what does that purpose look like? But I think we have to have clarity as a leadership team. And then from there, we've got to be able to communicate that effectively to our internal stakeholders as well as the external stakeholders.
Yeah. So being clear on the purpose myself as a leader, being able to communicate that to various stakeholders in the organization and outside of the organization. And then the only piece that I was thinking of that I know we've talked about before was, how do I then connect the individual and their role with the purpose of the organization?
Yes.
Which is sort of that final step, because I can have hundreds of employees running around talking about the purpose of an organization. That might be important to you, the leader, but I need to be able to tie that purpose to what I do every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. A book I just read was The Heart of Business by Hubert Joly. And he's the retired CEO from Best Buy. And that's why he talks a great deal about the book and the turnaround that they did. He talks about tying the individual's purpose to the corporate purpose and getting that in alignment. And it made a significant difference in the employee engagement and ultimately in the profitability of the company.
Yeah. So let's go back to leaders for just a second. And we said that a leader's desire to change is in their own confidence, in their ability to change. But what hinders change is fear.
Yes.
What are you seeing are some of the fears out there right now, culturally?
Culturally?
Well, culturally, but that affect the workplace. What are leaders wrestling with?
Right now, it's from a culture standpoint, it really does come back to how can I move my organization forward? Am I going to stay relevant 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And what changes do I need to make, to be able to stay in that leadership role? And I think that they see that in today's world, we're seeing a lot of their competitors. Some of them are thriving during these times, and others are they're just trying to survive. And so their fear there is, as I lose my people, how's that going to impact,
So what are the tools? What are the practical insights that you're giving leaders on any of what we've talked about. We've set the landscape, the foundation for this conversation. But what are the tools that you're giving leaders to say, hey, here's how you can overcome this fear. Here's how you can pull your employees back into this. Here's how you can establish purpose. What are some of the tools that you're giving leaders, or how are you helping them through this? How are you guiding them?
I think it comes back to, again, my philosophy is we cannot continue to manage one to a team. There has to be almost a one-to-one. Mm-hmm. So that means to be able to do that, you've got to get to know your people. And I think
Well, obviously we're experiencing some technical difficulties. So let's see if we can pull this thing back together. We were right in the middle of that conversation.
So I think that, how I'm guiding my clients on this topic is really helping them to, bring their team together. We got to first of all, we have to have a plan. And I think that's where that allows you to be able to really clearly identify what your priorities are going to be and what your objectives are. And then from there, then we can start to put in place different steps, different milestones along the way, as far as how we will go about measuring what the success of this is, over a monthly or over quarterly basis.
So sorry. Well, not sure what's going on here, but maybe these are unprecedented times.
Yes, exactly.
So unprecedented times in a highly technological world where we can't seem to get our internet working. But what we were talking about, what we were discussing, was in a world where the leader has to focus on the individual. Mm-hmm. In a world where it's not just one leader to a team, it's one-to-one. It's driving and helping an individual find purpose in their work. It's looking at the strategies and helping a team come to that conclusion. It's understanding the unique giftings and motivations of the individuals. How in the world does a leader have enough time to do that?
That is the question that they pose back to me often, because they do. They have all these things that they need to do and all these changes they need to make. But at the end of the day, they're trying to run their business and keep it profitable, and they have to make that happen. But I think that, so the way that you go about doing that is you can't do it all at once. So again, we got to have a plan, and then two, we need to just take many steps along the way to start to kind of test this out to see if it really does work and how comfortable you are as a leader in making this change. And then as you gain confidence, then you can start to make bigger changes.
All right. So let's talk about these people.
Okay.
See what I did there? This next generation, in the multi-generational workforce, there's all kinds of opinions and biases and beliefs and all that. What are some of the differences? You mentioned a few earlier: purpose, coach,
Mhm.
less about the paycheck, but what are the differences that you're seeing with this next generation?
I think that they want to, I mean, if you look at it from a social standpoint, they want to know not only what the purpose is, but they also want to know from a leadership perspective, what are your stances right now
Mm.
On different topics that are important to the environment, maybe that are important politically. And I see a lot of leaders that are very fearful about stepping out and trying to communicate what their beliefs are in those areas.
Yeah.
But I think that when it comes to the millennials and specifically even the Gen Z, that we have to look at the benefits or benefit offerings that we are giving to the employees. I think because there's such a huge there's a huge range in the needs of a millennial versus a baby boomer, just because we're at different stages in life. So we look at the different types of medical plans, high deductible to low deductible. We look at, things like mental health coverage. We look at issues like student loans and trying to provide, that doesn't mean as leaders and as owners that we have to pay for all of these benefits, but at least make the benefits available to the people so that they can have like a cafeteria to pull from.
Yeah.
So I think that's another key area. Another key area is just the way we communicate. Again, myself and a lot of baby boomers, we like to be communicated directly with. And that can be either face-to-face or phone or even email. But we see a lot of the younger generation, they prefer to be, text, direct message. That's their preferred way. My kids, they wanted to text me back. I'm like, pick up the phone and call me. No, they prefer that method. And so we have to be agile to recognize that's the way you prefer to be communicated with. I will communicate with you that way.
Yeah. So the whole topic of this book, Chuck, is how do we lead through the changes that we're seeing in the workplace? And if I can review the three things or three ideas that you just gave us, it's this next generation wants to hear where you are. What's your stance on things?
Right.
The viewpoint of the leader. Many leaders are fearful of that. But how can you communicate a viewpoint? Or at least maybe what they're really asking is, can you provide space where we can talk about this?
Okay.
Number two, benefits. What are the benefits? And not that you have to, as a leader, provide all these benefits, but how can you provide a menu of options for people? And then the third is communication.
Yes.
And understanding how individuals in this next generation want to be communicated with and how they want to communicate, which is a whole nother topic, Chuck, because in the world of remote and hybrid work, we now have synchronous or asynchronous communication.
Correct.
Which is a whole nother topic.
It is.
How are leaders responding to remote work these days?
The ones that are utilizing it are becoming more comfortable with that. And I think that we are still in that chapter right now where we are measuring, how productive are our people being? And I think that's something that they're going to continue to watch and monitor, the productivity as well as what the level of engagement is with those people as far as whether they are going to continue on.
Yeah, that's great. All right. So now that we've talked about leaders and their fear, we've talked about this multi-generational workforce. Let's talk about two other things that are happening in culture right now.
Okay.
Everyone's talking about quiet quitting and quiet firing. Do you have a perspective on this?
Yes. In fact, I saw a post yesterday on LinkedIn talking about this particular issue. And I totally subscribe to this because when you look at those two positions, the thing that at the end of the day we have to do is we have to be able to go deeper. So as a leader and even as people, we have to be willing to have deeper conversations about what's really going on.
Yeah.
And those deeper conversations are much easier to have if you and I have a relationship than it is if we are in a command and control type environment. Yeah.
It sounds to me like you keep going back to this one-on-one relationship thing.
I'm a huge advocate for that. Yes.
So let me just pose it as a question. Would you say that these new times in the workplace are requiring more so than ever before that a leader develop relationships with his or her people?
I think their people are their greatest asset. And I think to keep that value, you have to continue to invest in that asset. And that means having a personal relationship with them.
At what point along the way do you think we got away from this? Because, like, isn't that what we should be doing?
It's so I love that question, because the thing I wrestle with the most is this whole thing is it seems like such an easy fix. It's just bringing being human back to being a leader. It doesn't seem like there's any any major change has to happen. It comes back to the heart issue of the leader.
Yeah.
And I think that when we got away from that, I think that, as I look back over the last 30 years, 40 years, I think there's been more and more of a focus on profitability, and on that profitability comes back to lifestyle, and comes back to ego, and comes back to pride. Yeah. And I think that we've continued down that path. And I think until the pandemic hit, that was a real wake-up call for everyone.
Yeah. Well, I think since you brought it up, let's just take a look back at history for a second.
Okay.
How we got away from the need to develop relationships, I'll never know. But it does feel like maybe there was an expectation in the kind of industrial revolution that, hey, this is a job. You come to do a job, and then you leave for relationships. Mm-hmm. You leave for family, for community, for society, for maybe religious affiliation, for whatever. Well, I would argue that many of those structures are broken.
Yes.
Or have been broken over the last few decades. And so it appears as though people are now looking for some of those needs to be met in the workplace.
Exactly.
And so for a leader to meet these needs in these unprecedented times with this multi-generational workforce, it's going to require leaders to develop relationships. Doesn't that put me as a leader at risk?
I can see in certain situations where, yes, there could be a risk to doing that. But I think there's so much more to gain out of doing that. There's much more. I think if I'm investing my time with my people who are my greatest asset, I think that's where we as a leader are supposed to be. That's where we're supposed to be. So I think we have to invest that time.
Isn't vulnerability with my people bad?
I think that is what society would like us to think. The reality is being vulnerable with our people is a strength, because it bonds people together when you're able to do that. So, for example, I had a client that actually not a client, a person that read the book that called shortly after the Roe v. Wade decision came down, and they called on a Saturday and said, I know on Monday when my team comes back to the office, I know they're not going to be okay. You talked in the book about being able to having small groups and having, basically being able to create safety zones for people to talk about issues like this. Walk me through what that process looks like and how we go about implementing that. And so the business owner on Monday met with their teams, their departments individually, and they actually became vulnerable with their team up front to kind of set the stage on a time where they were challenged, they were anxious about, and the emotions that they felt and how they dealt with that. And then they opened it up to their people for them to talk about how they were impacted by the decision on Roe v. Wade. And their people were not okay. And so they began to see from their leader that it was okay to share what the feelings were and what their emotions were, and become transparent themselves. And by doing that, it brought security and safety to the people that spoke, but it also gave the opportunity for others within the group to come alongside them, to really comfort them and build relationships there. And so the owner called me afterwards and said, I was very, very reluctant to do this. I'm so grateful that we did, because it's changed the whole dynamic of our culture.
Wow. So I think a leader's willingness to be vulnerable, to pull people together, and to encourage the development of relationships within a culture, you're seeing benefit.
Absolutely.
And I guess maybe respond to this. Do you think that's what this multi-generational workforce is looking for?
I think that is what, yes, I think that's what the multi-generational workforce is looking for. And I think that it's interesting. We try to say that it's because of just the emotions of the millennials and a specific generation. I think when you look at humanity, that's what we're all looking for. So I don't think it makes a difference on what generation we come from. We're all looking for that relationship and that connectedness.
Well, I think you might have just said it best, which is the human need for love and belonging and connection is something that is shared regardless of what generation you're coming from. And so while some leaders that we're talking with would love to blame it on a certain generation or would love to compare generations and make huge sweeping generalizations about a specific generation, the reality is we're people. And so I guess what I'd love to do, Chuck, is give you one last shot at this to just say, all right, we're living in unprecedented times. We're living amongst a workplace that in many ways is unprecedented. Employees are reacting to news and media and quiet quitting TikTok videos and all the rest. What would you say? What advice would you give? What practical insights would you give to that leader? If you could wrap it all up and put a bow on this, what would you say to a leader today who's trying to manage their way through this, who's trying to attract and retain great people and talent? What would you say to them?
I think that when I think about leadership, the way the bow I would put around this is really focusing back on what I call the 5 C's, which really starts with communication. And that communication doesn't always mean talking, but it actually means asking questions and listening. So I think the 5 C's are communication, connection with all of your people and all your stakeholders. Then connection. So we have communication, connection, and commitment. One of the things we didn't talk about was the mission, vision, values.
Yeah.
And the fact that so much has changed since the pandemic that we need to, most organizations have changed since that time. So we need to go back and revisit to make sure that we've got accurate mission, vision, values so that we can truly commit to that. And then fourth is caring. And I think we just have to, again, we just talked about the heart of a leader, caring for your people and caring for our basic humanity in general. But then the last thing is being curious. I just think that we can never get to the place where we feel like we know everything, that we need to be asking questions of all of our people to get a diversity of opinions to really be able to lead our company and be able to be successful.
All right. So leaders leading during unprecedented times, be aware of how you're communicating. Be aware of how you're connecting. Be aware of how you are promoting commitment to your organization, to your cause, to your vision. Be aware and cognizant of how you're caring for people. And then remain curious.
Yes.
Keep asking questions. That's how we get to know people. That's how we build relationships. Keep asking questions. I love those 5 C's, Chuck. I guess those 5 C's go with Chuck Cooper, the 2 C's. So if you add the 2 C's to the 5 C's, this is the 7C guy.
There you go.
Chuck Cooper with his 5 C's: communication, connection, commitment, caring, and curious. Well, it's hard to believe that our time's already up.
Wow. It went by.
These things went by fast. For those of you who are watching us live, thanks for being here. We want to continue to encourage you. Feel free to ask questions, send in comments. We would love to address those after the fact. This is Chuck Cooper. His book is Unprecedented. You can find his book. I found it on Amazon.
Amazon's the best place to get it.
And if you want to know more about what Chuck is doing, what his organization, Whitewater Consulting, is doing, his book, you can find him. Google. It's an amazing tool. Or whichever search engine you like best, right? This wasn't an ad for Google. Anyway, Chuck, thanks for being here. Thanks for being a friend and a guest, and insightful in the workplace and for all the work that you're doing for small and mid-sized businesses.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chris.
You're welcome. To those of you who watch us regularly here, thank you for joining with us. This is another episode of the Always About People show. We look forward to seeing you next time.